Hi everyone, good afternoon or whatever time it is where you are. I am Stacy Brock. I'm a materials and applications specialist here at Golden Artist Colors. And today we're going to talk about our SoFlat Matte Acrylics and matte painting in general. And we would love for this to be a question and answer session. So please feel free to throw any questions you might have into the chat, and I will answer as many as I can directly. Today we're really going to just talk about what these paints can be used for, and like I said, matte painting in general. These paints are more, the SoFlat acrylics are more matte, more opaque, and more leveling than any other paint line made by Golden. So the biggest difference to them straight out of the jar is the feel of these paints, and that's something that you really need to put your hands on them, put a brush in there, stir them, or a palette knife just to stir them around, and you can feel the difference immediately. They are very leveling. So what does that mean? That means that when you paint them on, they tend to not hold onto brush strokes. They want to lay down very flat, and they dry very matte. So they really don't have a tendency to hold on to brush strokes. That doesn't mean that they're not going to have any brush strokes. You might see some, but because these paints are so matte, that if you see some brush strokes in your application and you take a few steps back from that, they don't reflect any light off of those peaks, and so they look completely flat. So these have all been formulated to have high pigment load like our other paint lines, as well as little to no reflectance. So let's go to the overhead camera here. And so you can see this is our color chart. It's available in 40 colors. And I can pick this up and show you that there's no light reflecting off of these colors. They're very flat. They're called SoFlat because they are flat in appearance, but also in application. So you can see they're great for doing graphic type of imagery, large color field paintings, as hard edge paintings, detail. They're very leveling, but that doesn't mean that you can't get a lot of detail, and so much so that they can be also used as an acrylic gouache. We get that question very often. Are these acrylic gouache? In the sense that pretty much any product that's called an acrylic gouache is just a very matte acrylic paint. So yes, they can be used that way. And we're going to talk about some application tips and stuff like that, but I would love to get some questions so so that I can answer anything that might be burning inside of you that you've been thinking about. Please feel free to do that. And I'm here with my colleagues Mike and Allison and Todd, and they're going to send some of those questions over my way. And it looks like Mike has a question.
Hi everybody, this is Mike. Emily asks, are they better on wood or canvas?
They can be used on either, and they can be used on anything that will accept acrylic paints. So they're great on any of those things. So that's really a personal preference of what you want to paint on. Despite the fact that these paints have a lot of solids in them to make them matte, a lot of pigment in them, some matting solids, they're still very flexible. So should be fine on primed or unprimed canvas, primed or unprimed wood, as acrylics adhere to those substrates permanently, so they don't necessarily need a primer. Thanks for that question, Emily. So just to show you a couple of the attributes of these paints, I'm going to push this aside, and I want to show you, this is the yellow-green. And what you can see right off the bat is there's a dark color on top. So it is normal for these paints to have some separation in the container. They do say on them, stir thoroughly before use. And this is, I believe, a brand new container. So I'm going to open that up and show you that separation. So don't get nervous if you see that. It is totally normal. And all I'm going to do here is stir it together. And what is so lovely about these paints is that They don't, stirring it, you can be pretty aggressive when you're stirring. You can actually pick up these containers and shake them as well, which is something we don't necessarily recommend in our other paint lines, because the other paint lines tend to hold on to bubbles a lot, but these are so leveling that they don't really hold on to bubbles. And you can see as I'm stirring this, I'm not getting any bubbles in this mixture. Yes, Mike.
Hi, Lynette asks, can it be used in a fluid art for acrylic pours?
Sure, absolutely. You can mix these paints with any other golden paints or mediums. So if you want to do a pour with these paints, our ratio for that would be color pouring medium, gloss, or matte, or GAC 800, with 10 parts medium to 1 part paint. You can adjust as necessary, but that's a great starting ratio, and it still makes a very opaque application. So you can use them in a pour. And the color pouring medium matte would probably be the one you would choose, because if you're choosing these paints, you probably want a matte surface at the end. Thank you for that question. The other thing you do want to do here also, before you close this container back up, you want to wipe down the threads so that it doesn't dry on the outside. A couple of reasons you want to do that. You want to make sure it makes a tight closure, and if there's any paint in the threads that might get in the way with closing this tightly, you know, acrylics dry through evaporation, and air getting to them will cause them to dry out. So you want to make sure that that's closed tightly. And if there's any dried paint on the edges, it doesn't fall in when you go to use it again. Yes, Allison.
So while you're talking about paint drying, how does the dry time for this line compare to other golden paint lines?
The dry time is very similar. So these are a regular fast drying acrylic paint. They are not slow drying paints like our open. So they're going to have the same dry time as our regular, the other heavy body fluid and high flow. It depends on the absorbency of your surface. If you're working on a very absorbent surface, they're going to dry faster because they absorb in. Also, dry time with acrylics in general is so environmentally dependent. So if you're in a cool, humid space, the paints are going to dry a lot slower than if you're in a warm, dry space. So if you're trying to speed up the drying of something, you might want to warm up your studio a little bit, lower the humidity, or have a fan moving some air. You don't really want heated air, just regular fan on can help. Moving the air around your studio can help the paints dry faster too. Yes.
Hi there. We have Phil who is asking about starter sets with smaller containers. You want to talk about the 2 sets that we have?
Sure. We have a pop set and a zing set that have, I believe, 6 or 8 colors. Is it 6 or 8? 6. 6 colors, different colors in each set. Very bright. One is, they do pop and zing, and that's why they're called that. They're really, you know, what's unique about this line as well is there are some colors that are only available in this line. There are some unique mixtures of colors. There are some colors that you will recognize and some that are not, just like this yellow-green is not available in any other paint line than this SoFlat. There's a bunch of colors that you're not going to find elsewhere. Great, and Mike just put a link up there to the sets so you could see what's available. And, okay. So if you want to mix these with mediums, and you want to keep this flat application, this flat appearance when it's dry, I can show you this panel here, which shows the SoFlat acrylics mixed with some of our mediums. There is only one gloss product in here, and that's really to show you what happens when you mix these paints with a medium that has a higher sheen. It is going to raise the sheen. So the ones that you mix with it, if you want to just directly extend, these paints are super matte medium is the best one to do so. It should not raise the sheen. And on this board here, this is just the SoFlat, I believe it is the dark green. And this is the SoFlat brushed across the top here. These are the mediums on their own. This is with the SoFlat painted on top of the mediums. And this is what happens when you mix it into the mediums. So you can see here the Crackle Paste, the fine pumice, the fiber paste, the light molding paste, a super matte medium, fluid matte medium, pastel ground, all keep this application very matte. This soft gel gloss, when you paint it on top, it's still going to be matte, but once you mix something glossy into there, it's going to raise the sheen of these paints. The other notable thing on this board is this Crackle Paste here. Crackle Paste can only tolerate about 10% of an addition of any other product into it, whether it's a color or another medium. And if you add more than that, it essentially fixes. This is a controlled failure, Crackle Paste. We generally don't want our paints to crack, but in this one we do. So this is a controlled failure. So what happens is if you mix more than 10% of paint into something else, it's not going to crack as much. You're fixing that issue, and so it will no longer crack. This is like right on the verge of having too much in there to stop it from cracking. And here we could show you the difference between these paints and the exact same color in our other lines. This is a Napthol Red Light. In the heavy body, you can see it's a naturally glossy pigment. In our other paint lines, we don't standardize the sheen. It's what's inherent in the pigment itself, and some pigments are naturally glossy and some are naturally matte. So you can see here, in heavy body, it's very glossy. Open here, it's glossy too. Fluid, also glossy. High flow, still glossy. And SoFlat there, no sheen. Yes, Mike.
Hi, Mauricio is asking, could you please talk about why sometimes acrylic layers of paint can crack or make some exploited surfaces?
So, most acrylic paints should not crack upon, they're very flexible, so it can depend upon the surface that you're working upon, if it happens to be very absorbent. I'm not sure where it is that you're seeing the cracking, so if you maybe explain what product or where you've seen cracking, because these paints are really rather flexible. There is also a difference between a crack versus a craze, and what you might be seeing in some of your paints is a craze. The acrylics dry through evaporation, which I mentioned earlier, and what that means that the first thing to evaporate out of the acrylic is the water, and that's when it becomes touch dry. If you're in a very warm, dry space, or if you try to force dry your paints with heat, like a hair dryer, basically what happens is a skin dries on top of that paint film before the inside or underneath dries. And when the water tries to evaporate out of that skin, it tears through it. And that is what we call a craze, which can look like a crack. So force drying with heat is not really a good idea. It's best to just let things dry in their own time. And if you, like I said earlier, if you warm up your room a little bit and lower the humidity, it'll dry faster, or have a fan. Okay. So here the difference, not only the difference in viscosity as well as sheen. One unique attribute about the SoFlat acrylics as well is they're what we call thixotropic. And what does that mean? Oh, that is heavy body. What was that word? Thixotropic. Thixotropic means that when you first put your palette knife into, they feel a bit thick. They feel thick even though we describe them as being fluid. And once you start to stir them or work with them, they shear out. So they get thinner as you work with them. And that's a rather unique attribute of this particular line. So here, one of the things also about Golden in general is we put a lot of information on our labels. And if you're in a store and you're looking at the paint, what you can tell here is that this there's so much information. We have the opacity transparency symbol, we have ASTM rating, we have the pigment information, but there's a lot of information in this hand-painted color swatch. Notably, it's over a black and white stripe, and so that's going to show you how opaque or transparent that color is. It's also going to show you what that color looks like dry, because there is a wet to dry color shift with acrylics. Versus opening the container in the store to see what the color is not going to be as accurate as the dry swatch here. But it also shows the sheen, and here you could see this one is not reflecting any light, whereas this one is. So if you're on the store shelf and you're confused by which paint line or which one you want, just take a look. That hand-painted color swatch has so much information in it. Okay. Some other applications you can use these with. Really, these can be used in any way the other paints are used. Like I said earlier, you can mix them together, but you can still use these in an airbrush. If you thin them with some airbrush medium or open thinner. You can use these in refillable markers. And I have this Pyro Red here that I put into a refillable marker. And the formula that I used to thin the paint down to do so was 3 parts open thinner. So 10 parts paint, 3 parts open thinner, and 3 parts water. So I'm going to write that down. Use this pen. So you push it down to get it to activate. It's a pump marker. So 10 to 3 to 3, right? So this, thank you. And Mike put a video in the comments there. So you can see this is 10 parts SoFlat. Let's charge that back up. And again, these have mixing balls inside. You do want to shake them before you use them. And if you need to charge the paint down the marker, you just push in the top. So that's SoFlat to open thinner. That's a chisel tip. It's getting me. Open thinner to water. So really, you can do anything with these paints. And why would you choose these over another line? If you want everything a very matte finish, if you want applications that don't show brush strokes, if you want a really flat graphic, these colors are bright. They are incredibly bright, despite having a lot of matting solids in there, which normally would dull a paint. But our head chemist, Jim, had a hard time, actually, to quite some time to formulate these paints to balance all of those things. To make normally when you put a lot of solids into a paint, they tend to thicken up and not level so well. So he had a bit of a challenge making these very matte and making them also level, and he did a great job. They feel velvety and smooth when you apply them. They're just a joy to use. Okay. Let's see, some other tips for application. They're not really designed to be a thick paint. Like I said, they are leveling. So if you do want them thicker, you might want to layer them. What you'll find when you put more layers on of this paint is that you might get some brush drag in a second coat. So what we found works really well is to add some water. Just add some water to thin it, maximum 15% in these paints, but just a touch of water helps them go on a lot smoother in a second coat. If you build up a lot of layers of this paint, it's going to raise the sheen, essentially reducing the absorbency as you go. So it'll raise the sheen slightly in multiple coats. But these are designed to cover really well. So some of the same colors in their counterparts in the other line might be a bit more translocation or appearance. We'd be happy. Oh, here's another kind of cool application, which is our light molding paste tinted with SoFlat. First, SoFlat is painted as a base here, the darker color, and then mixed with light molding paste and run through a stencil. You can take a scraper or a putty knife, a credit card, any flat surface, and you run it over the stencil. Then you pull off the stencil, and then you have this behind, and you can see it's a very beautiful matte appearance. And it's interesting here on the screen too, because this does have some relief to it because it's light molding paste, but because it's so flat and it doesn't reflect any light, you can't really see that texture in there, especially straight on. Okay, so these paints can be used, again, if you are an acrylic gouache user, if it is something that you are used to using, these paints absolutely can be used in that application. They're not like traditional gouache is a water-soluble paint like watercolors. These are going to strap down permanently, so you don't need to worry about color lift if you're doing another layer on top of it. And if you wanted to make these a bit more fluid, again, you can add, if they're thicker than you would prefer, you can add some water, you can add some super matte medium in there. Or if you just want to extend the paint, because you basically to make more is what I mean by extend. Okay. And again, here's the color chart, which shows how bright these colors are. And speaking of bright colors, you'll notice down here we have 6 fluorescent colors in SoFlat. They don't really show that well in the camera. Camera tends to not pick up something that will fluoresce. Actual camera won't pick that up, but our eyes do, as do black lights. So these will glow in black light. And fluorescent pigments are not actual pigments, they are dyes. So the poor light fastness rating. These are the only colors in any golden, out of any golden colors that have a poor light fastness rating, and the only reason why we carry them is because people want them and they're so beautiful. So you can put UV protection on them if you do not want them to fade, but if you really love a fluorescent color or you want to do some kind of black light effects, these are wonderful. And the difference between these, first of all, we have a fluorescent violet in this line, which we don't have of violet in any other line. These are a bit more opaque. Fluorescent dyes tend to be very transparent. And in this line, they are semi-transparent. So they are more opaque in this line than they are in the heavy body or the high flow line. Yes, Mike?
This is just a comment. Dinara says that green is spicy.
This, I agree. Green is my favorite color, and yellow greens in particular. So I completely agree with you. Thank you for that comment. You should make an all green painting. Yes, there's a bunch of greens in this line too that are unique. These 3, the permanent green, dark green, and yellow green here on this chart are unique to this line. The permanent green is similar to the permanent green light, but it is different as we change the name because it is not the same color as the permanent green light. It's a little bit darker. The red violet, the blue violet, naphthol pink, all of these colors are unique to this line. So even if you don't necessarily have interest in just a matte paint and you want to expand your palette, you might consider trying some of these new colors as well. Yes?
What's the best medium or paint or gel to work with?
Yes, if you want to keep the matte sheen here, if you don't want to raise it, you can mix it with anything that you want, but if you mix it with a gloss, a semi-gloss, a satin, you're going to raise the sheen of these paints, meaning they're going to become glossier. So if you want to mix it with a medium and not raise the sheen, our super matte medium, if for a fluid medium, it would be a direct extender. It's not going to change the consistency very much or the sheen. And if you want to thicken them up, you can use our extra heavy gel matte. So you want to keep the matteness. Thank you for that question. Yes, we have another.
So another question, which is actually a question I have and I've just never asked a coworker, is what does naphthol mean?
This is the pigment. It's the pigment name. Here at Golden, we tend to not really. We steer away from using romantic names. We really like to let people know what is inside their paint, and naphthol is the chemical description of that color. So. It is the pigment color. That's the chemical description name of that. I don't know the chemical makeup of it. I might need to find that out for you and answer it later. So, thank you for that. That's a good question, though. You'll notice on all of our paint lines, we call them phthalos and quinacridones, benzimidazolone, all of these words that are rather hard to say. We have a lot of nicknames for them. Phthalocyanide is the real full name of that. We already make it a nickname. We call it phthalo because people can't pronounce it. Quinacridones we call quins. The benzimidazolones you could call it benz or benzy. If you call us up and ask us questions and you have trouble saying those names, don't feel bad about shortening it. Anthraquinone or anthraquinone, we call anthra, right? So don't feel bad if you have a hard time pronouncing the chemical names of them. We make nicknames and we'll understand you. And I just want to mention, we are here all the time to answer your questions through email, through phone calls. So please feel free to give us a call or shoot us an email if you have any questions about anything. The information is right there. So feel free to jot that down. We say it all the time, help@goldenpaints.com. Feel free to contact us with any questions you might have about artist materials in general, any artist materials. Do we have any other questions, or are we caught up?
Yeah, there's.
So a question from Judith is, you mentioned UV protection on paint. Does Golden offer a product with UV protection?
Absolutely. So we offer any Golden product that has the word varnish on it is going to be a removable top coat for conservation purposes, and it carries UV protection. In fact, the three products that we have that are those removable varnishes are a polymer varnish with UVLS, MSA varnish with UVLS, and archival varnish with UVLS. All of those, the UVLS stands for ultraviolet light stabilizers, and they filter UV from anything that is below it. I have an example here I can show you. There is an article on our justpaint.org website that when we first introduced these paints, and if you can pan out a little bit, Todd, I'm going to show that this panel, and I can lean it up, so what you can see here, this is not a panel, actually, it's a canvas, right? And it has SoFlat paint, it has gesso and then SoFlat painted on it. And what you can see is in these sections here, we had applied an isolation coat, which is our recommendation before varnishing, so that if the varnish ever needed to be removed, you would remove down to the isolation coat and don't risk any damage to the paint. So half of this had an isolation coat and half of this did not. And we applied the polymer varnish matte on this section and the MSA varnish matte on this section. And we did some removal also onto this side. This is the removal, removing down to that isolation coat. It may sound counterproductive that we recommend a glossy product on top of something matte. And the reason why we do that is because these varnishes also contain matting solids. And matte surface is very absorbent. So if you tried to put the varnish directly on here, a matte or the satin or matte varnishes directly on here without putting an isolation coat, you might get a streaky application. You could see I did it rather successfully here, but I am used to using these varnishes, so it's an experienced hand. But you could see here, I removed, when I did the removal of here without the isolation coat on, there was a little bit of color lift in that removal where there was none where we had the isolation coat. So you could see here in this middle section, had nothing added. There's nothing on top of here, no varnish. This is just a SoFlat. So the sheen changes very, very, very slightly with the matte varnish. It's a very slight raise in sheen, almost not noticeable. Yes.
Your painting looks really great, by the way, on the screen. Just letting you know.
Oh, thank you.
Also, Emily asked, what are the best brushes for acrylics? But I think you might want to expand that also for SoFlat.
Absolutely. Yeah. So for acrylics in general, a soft synthetic bristle, you want to use a synthetic bristle. Acrylics are rather hard on natural bristles. Don't buy expensive sable brushes and use them with acrylics. It will destroy your brush. And a really coarse bristle like a natural hog bristle as well, they're just really harsh on. It strips the natural oils out of them. So synthetic brushes work really well. What we found when applying the SoFlat paints is that the widest flat brush you can use for your synthetic bristle flat brush you can use for your application applies it the best, goes on evenly without brush strokes. You don't want to overwork something. If something starts to get brush drag as you're applying it, it's going to hold on to more texture and brush strokes. So really just get it on and get it even. We tried a lot of brushes with these and actually was very successful. One thing that we normally don't recommend with our other paint lines is to use a foam brush. Foam brushes add air bubbles into it. But as I mentioned earlier, this paint tends to not hold on to air bubbles. It levels out. It was even successful with a foam brush application. So it's kind of hard to fail when it comes to brushes with this paint. Thanks. That was a really good question. Thank you for asking that. Any other questions? No, I think we're caught up.
I think that's everything from the comments, but as you mentioned earlier, help@goldenpaints.com is a great place to send your questions.
Absolutely, especially if you're watching this, but this will live on our page for quite some time. So if you watch it later, if you're watching this not live and you have questions that you want to ask, the best way to do so would be to email us at help@goldenpaints.com or call this phone number right here. Thank you so much for joining us and celebrating this new paint line with us that we're really excited about. So please, thanks again. It's always a joy to have an interaction with people out there. So thank you so much. Have a great day.